Mishpacha, it's Courtney, America's Jewish mother, and I'm here today to do something I don't think I've actually done before on this channel, which is I'm going to do a single book review of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera, because I finished this book last night, and oh boy, do I have some thoughts about it. So this is going to have spoilers in it, just to go ahead and forewarn you, so if you do not want to hear spoilers for this book, click away. So first let me just tell you the basic premise of this in case you are unfamiliar. So this is the story of Florentino Ariza and Fermina Daza. And so basically you find out at the very beginning of the book that Fermina, like, they had a relationship of sorts in their youth, right? She was, I don't know, like in her late teens, early 20s, and he was 4 years older than she was, Florentino, at the time that they had their relationship of sorts. But Fermina eventually decides to marry another man, Dr. Juvenal Urbino, instead. And within the first 50 pages of this book, you see them as older people. They're in their 70s or something at this point, Fermina and Dr. Urbino. And you see Dr. Urbino die. And then at the funeral, or at the visitation or wake or whatever we're calling it, Florentino shows up and professes his still ongoing love for Fermina, and she basically angrily throws him out and says she doesn't want to see him anymore, ever again. So then the book sort of backtracks from there, and you see what Fermina and Florentino's relationship was like, and you see her decide to, not stay with him and break things off, and then you see her decide to marry Dr. Urbino, and eventually you get some insight, took a while, but eventually you get some insight into why she decided not to stay with Florentino and why she decided to marry Dr. Urbino. And you kind of just see their lives take these divergent paths. So to me, most of the book is a real study in contrast between the two of them. Because, Fermina breaks off their love affair and, basically moves on with her life and has a life. And Florentino just stays obsessed with her the entire time. And even though he has, many, many, many sexual affairs, well over 600, and I'm not exaggerating with that number, by the way, that's an accurate number. It's well over 600 love affairs that he has. Thankfully, they're not all recounted in this book, otherwise it'd be a lot longer. But anyway, so he has all of these basically meaningless love affairs and just stays obsessed with Fermina this entire time and doesn't move on with his life at all. So it's very much a study in contrast between the actual relationship of Dr. Urbino and Fermina and sort of the compromises that they have to make and the concessions that they make to each other, because that's what you do when you're in a long-term relationship with someone, and that's also what you do when you actually love someone, versus the very single-minded, obsessive, goal-obsessed, and oriented love of Florentino for Fermina, where she's not even in the picture, right? Like, she's married some other guy and moved on with her life, and he's still hung up on her. And meanwhile, he has, meaningless affairs with over 600 women, at least one of which, probably more than one, but at least one of which is super problematic, and I'm going to get to that eventually. And just, can't move on with his life. And even though he realizes at some point that he has the capacity to feel love for these other women, he never pursues that. For whatever reason, he just stays hung up on Fermina and refuses to move on with his life and pretty much just stagnates and basically wastes almost his whole life. So that's essentially the premise of the book. I am going to talk about the ending eventually, because it kind of wrecked the book for me. Actually, you know what? I'll just go ahead and talk about the ending now. So at the very end of the book, within the last 30 pages, after Dr. Urbino has died and Florentino comes back into the picture, and eventually he sort of befriends Fermina, and she's, a little reluctant to kind of let him back in because he just seems so hung up on their past and nostalgic about it and wanting to start things back up with her again, and she feels like this is very inappropriate and she doesn't want to do that. Eventually, he does sort of befriend her, and she feels like she does actually get to know him in a way that she did not when they were carrying on their love affair in their youth. And I use quotation marks because the fact of calling it a love affair is even weird to me, because they barely knew each other. It was basically a love affair on paper as a correspondence through letter writing, because I think they only maybe spent 2 or 3 times where they were actually physically in each other's presence. Like, there was no kissing, there was no hand holding, there was definitely no sex, or anything even leading up to that. It was all, very chaste, and it was like totally a love affair on paper. So they barely knew each other, and they barely even spoken to each other in person or spent time together in person. They just wrote all these letters back and forth in like this insane, crazed passion of youth. So anyway, right, to the end of the book. So then, basically within the last 30 pages, Marquez lets Florentino and Fermina wind up together, and it just made me so irrationally angry. And really, that's for 2 main reasons. One, Florentino is horrible, and I think letting him and Fermina get together is basically rewarding his bad behavior throughout the book, which I will talk more about in a minute. But the other reason that it made me so mad and furious is that I feel like it undercuts the entire point of the book, because up until, again, about the last 30 pages or so, the entire book is basically, like I said, shows this sort of study and contrast between Fermina, who actually moves on with her life and has a life, and Florentino, who basically wastes his whole life because he's obsessed about getting with this woman who clearly doesn't want to be with him, So I feel like allowing them to finally come together at the end, even though, it's in old age and they're both, around 80 or whatever, it like undercuts the whole message of the book that Florentino should have like gotten over himself and moved on with his life. The other reason why it so infuriated me is because Florentino is not a good person. He just, number one, like, it's shitty when a woman tells you no to keep hounding her anyway. So that's number one. Number two, he has all of these sexual affairs with women, some of whom catch feelings for him, and he doesn't care. He's just in it for the sex. And possibly and probably the worst offense is toward the end of the book, not quite at the end of the book, it's in like the next to last section. He has put into his care some distant relation of his who's 14 years old at the time, named America Vicuña or something like that. And anyway, her parents put her into his charge, and he's like in his late 60s or around 70 at this point, and he totally grooms her and has a sexual relationship with her like a gross Humbert pervert. And it's literally depicted that way in the book too. It says, something like that he, slowly sort of won her over, in the guise of a grandfather, while all the time, leading her to his secret slaughterhouse. Like, I'm not, like, that's a slight paraphrase, but that phrase, secret slaughterhouse, comes up in the book with respect to that. So that's terrible. The fact that he, uses all of these women just for his own physical satisfaction and distraction from the fact that he's, still hung up on this woman who, spurned him in his youth, basically. But that he also ruins the life of a 14-year-old girl, grooms her, and, preys on her sexually. And, I already said I was going to spoil things that happen in this book, but spoiler alert, she ends up committing suicide. So yeah, the fact that Florentino is sort of rewarded, dramatically speaking, by finally getting to be with the woman that he's wanted to be with for 50 plus years, after all of that, after all of his wasted time, after all of the women he's hurt, after, sexually assaulting and grooming a child and preying on her like a pedophile, and leading her to commit suicide. I mean, it's disgusting. So the end of this book basically ruined it for me. In terms of the prose of this book, the actual writing is quite beautiful. This edition that I have was translated by Edith Grossman, so possibly some of the choices are a matter of translation choices, but I'm sure Marquez's original prose is also beautiful, because 100 Years of Solitude, which I'm pretty sure was translated by a different person, but I don't have that copy in front of me right now, I also found to have very beautiful writing, so I'm sure Marquez is the common denominator, it's not just the translation, but I will read you some excerpts. So this is the very first line of the book. It was inevitable. The scent of bitter almonds always reminded him of the fate of unrequited love. And I love that, because basically for the most part in this book, again, except for like the last 30 to 40 pages, you kind of see that play out, and you see that Florentino's unrequited love for Fermina basically acts as a poison to him and poisons his life and makes it so that he doesn't have a real life. Here's another quotation. It is as if he were not a person, but only a shadow. That is what he was, the shadow of someone whom no one had ever known. And I'm not going to sort of explain that, because some of these are happening later on in the book. She was left dangling, barely at the entrance of her tunnel of solitude, while he was already buttoning up again, as exhausted as if he had made absolute love on the dividing line between life and death, when in reality he had accomplished no more than the physical act that is only a part of the feat of love. And then the last little excerpt I wanted to read, just to sort of give an example of how lovely and beautiful the prose in this is. It was as if they had leapt over the arduous cavalry of conjugal life and gone straight to the heart of love. They were together in silence like an old married couple weary of life, beyond the pitfalls of passion, beyond the brutal mockery of hope and the phantoms of disillusion, beyond love. For they had lived together long enough to know that love was always love, any time and any place, but it was more solid the closer it came to death. So I felt very conflicted about this book upon finishing it, because the writing is beautiful, and again, with the exception of the ending, I pretty much agree with the message that it presents. But because the ending so undercuts the message that I felt like I was getting throughout most of the book, which is, don't be an obsessive jackass and waste your life pining away for somebody who doesn't want you. Move on. Take a shot with somebody else. Have a real life. Stop being a jerk and just using women for your physical gratification and for nothing else. It totally undercuts that message. So, you know, if you want to read this book and you haven't already read it, and my review of it hasn't talked you out of reading it, stop like, you know, around page like 300, 310. Don't read anymore. Otherwise, you're going to be just as frustrated as I was. But yeah, I'm curious. If you have read this book, what are your feelings about it? Also, this book is sort of presented as this great love story, and I felt like one thing I actually liked about it is that it kept defying my expectations in the beginning for what it was going to be. But then, again, Marquez just wrong-footed me again at the end, and even though it basically led up to, you know, them not being together and not ultimately getting together, surprise, they ended up getting together, like I said, in the last 30 pages. So, I did like that this book kept me on my toes. I liked the message, again, except for the ending. And the prose writing is quite beautiful, but yeah, I just felt so conflicted because Florentino was kind of horrible, and because of the way the book ends, and also because of the pedophilia. So yeah, I'm curious, if you read this book and you have thoughts about it, please let me know down in the comments below. If you disagree with me and you think this is like the greatest book ever written, please tell me why. Like, why can you overlook the pedophilia and the grooming and the sexual assault and and yeah, and if you agree with me, let me know too. And if you, like me, also feel conflicted, you can let me know that too. But yeah, so that is my review, rambling though it was, probably, sorry about that, of Love in the Time of Cholera. So again, if you have thoughts about this, please let me know. I hope you're doing good reading whatever you're reading. I hope you're staying healthy and well, and until next time, would it kill you to call your mother?